Uh, Thank you. Hello, welcome, Jared. I actually don't know your last name.
My last name is Ware.
Okay.
Yeah.
For me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for accepting my invite and joining us to explain some difficult concepts today. I'm just gonna try and pin you here, which is weirdly difficult. All right, I'm gonna do this instead. No, I can't. Never mind. Yes, sorry about that. For me, your last name is Millennials Are Killing Capitalism.
Yeah, that's
because that's where I know you from. I've been following your podcast for, I don't know, almost 2 years now. I think for me, it started after the genocide started. But you've been going on for 8 years?
8 years, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Has to follow for me because it dives deep into topics that you normally don't hear elsewhere, or angles that you don't hear elsewhere. But with that said, would you like to introduce yourself a bit so that people know you better?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you. It's certainly a dark time that we are in right now, and I think one few things that gives me some joy is just to be in conversation with people and to talk through things. And so I appreciate the invitation. So I host the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live streams on YouTube. And then my partner, Josh Briand, and I have been running Millennials Are Killing Capitalism as an audio podcast going back to the fall of 2017. And, at the time that we created it, we just felt like there was a void in terms of media in the United States that was anti-imperialist. And this was at a time when there was also an upsurge in what wouldn't be left-wing politics in Sweden, but for the United States with our very fascistic and right-wing kind of political economy, something like Bernie Sanders represented really something that was outside of the norm of politics in the United States in 2016 with the presidential run that he had. And so with that moment, there were some different things that were happening. I mean, one was there was a lot of work that the ruling class also did to kind of, there's a way in which he was elevated as a candidate, and then a way that his candidacy was also used to tell people that they were kind of ridiculous. And so there was a term called Bernie Bros that was thrown around a lot, which was basically this idea of this white class reductionist person who wanted social democracy, essentially. And, the media would brand this as socialism or communism because of the anti-communism that's deeply embedded in the United States. But of course, it was really like, we would like to have some things that maybe the UK or France has. Like, that's really the sort of full spectrum of what that political project was. And I think for both Josh and I, our frustration in that moment was, on the one hand, being somewhat mobilized and interested in the fact that someone was even using the word socialism or saying something like democratic socialism, which was not something that, I mean, I'm older than Josh, and, so I was born in 81, and I had never seen a presidential candidate that would utter those kinds of words. And so that was interesting, and it certainly mobilized and galvanized a lot of young folks that were tired of what United States politics were coming after things like Occupy as well as Black Lives Matter movement. But there was also a lot of limitations, and we see those today when we see what a Zionist that Bernie Sanders is, and he always was, and that there was always these issues of whenever, so-called issues of foreign policy, which is what we like to say in the United States, came up, that he had an imperialist line as well. And so he wasn't really advocating any kind of, revolutionary transformation, even though he liked to use the word revolution. And I think for both Josh and I, it was like, okay, it's a moment where people are talking about these things and interested in these ideas, and we are too, and we actually haven't studied them enough ourselves at this point. So even you can see that in some of our early episodes that we didn't really, I don't think, know what we were talking about for the first, couple of years of doing the podcast. But we also knew very well that there were traditions of socialists and communist movements in the United States that were anti-imperialist, or that, did believe in self-determination of, Black and brown folks in particular, the Black Panthers, for instance, being like one, good point of departure for this conversation. And we just didn't see spaces where those movements and histories were authentically engaged. And so that was kind of like a starting point. But for both of us, we also knew that we had more to learn than what we knew. And so we were interested in learning and doing it in public and having people learn alongside us. And that's been the project, and it's obviously evolved along the way because we learn things along the way. There are certain, tendencies or positions or people we talk to along the way where sometimes you go through a conversation and you realize, yeah, I'm actually not politically aligned with that sort of project anymore, or I don't think that project really has something to offer us that is that relevant to the kind of politics that we want. And so those things change over time. And then other things happen like October 7th. And, then, there's a need to, delve deeper into different political issues with folks that have a good sense of them. And so, yeah, it's gone a lot of different directions, but that's kind of been the journey.
Thank you. And on that note, you have had a great series with Abdul Jawad Omar from West Bank, Palestine. I recommend that to everyone. Also, some great episodes with Stephen Salaita. They have been fantastic. And you also had other people talking about Palestine and giving some historical and contemporary background to a deeper analysis to all of that's happening.
Yeah, I would just say quickly, just in response to that, people have been very generous over the years with their time with us. And I think in the beginning of doing a podcast, it can be even intimidating to reach out to certain people. And it wasn't really until 2020 and, the COVID and lockdowns and, then the George Floyd protests that I think we got bolder in terms of who we would reach out to. But yeah, we've been blessed to have a lot of amazing guests that I wouldn't have predicted when we started out that we would be able to have those kind of, relationships. And Abdul Jawad is an amazingly generous person with his time and, has, and Stephen Salaita as well too. And, they've just been great. And others, Lara Shihai, we've done a lot of stuff with. So yeah, that's a beautiful aspect of doing it. And then, I don't think people always understand. It's like, people are really volunteering their time to do that kind of stuff. And it's very meaningful.
Yeah. And it's a great way of putting it. And you're blessed. And through you, we are blessed as well. So that's great. Thank you for sharing. So the idea I had today that we would talk about counterinsurgency. It's a topic that when you utter the name, it's like conspiracy theory bells are ringing in people's heads. So maybe it would be good to start with some definitions, like what is counterinsurgency? What is insurgency? Why does it matter? And to give people some background, like why we're talking with you about it, because you have had several episodes about the topic. You've had book circles about the issue as well. You have a Patreon where people can subscribe and then take part in book circles as well. So you've done significant deep dives into the topic. So that's why I thought we should discuss this with you. So,
yeah, I mean, what I'll say is when you read it, and this is the thing, is that there's so much counterinsurgency literature that someone can't even like digest all of it. Like, so there's a lot that I don't know because I'm not in the military, and some wonk who works for the Rand Corporation or something like that just like spends their entire life being paid to study, conflict and think about how to win these conflicts on behalf of empire and the state, but it's certainly not conspiratorial, because when you read what they say, they're quite clear in what they do, and they don't have any. There's a lot of things that are said within counterinsurgency literature that I think I would hope that most people would be taken aback when they read it, in terms of the level of violence, the willingness to kill, the way that they define people as enemies and use that language, and a sort of acceptance of a lot of conceptions that I think are just morally and totally bankrupt. And as Orasami Burton, someone who I've had a number of conversations with as well, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but these are people with a very cynical and kind of pessimistic view of human nature, and so they're people who think that essentially anyone who wants to improve their society through any means other than just going to the ballot box, however frequently your country has elections, is a potential enemy of the state. And so there's a lot of different ways to talk about it, and it's hard to pin down because counterinsurgents themselves have different definitions of these things. What I would say is that there's a blending of the ideas of an insurgent and the ideas of a subversive, and that they don't know where these things sort of begin, how they develop, and how they end, really. And so they become fearful constantly. This is counterinsurgents. They become fearful constantly that any form of political action could lead to revolution, essentially. And some of us might say, well, that's not such a bad thing. But to them it is. And so that's a really important, I guess, starting point to understand, is that the whole field of counterinsurgency is premised on the idea that the existing order in the world or within a nation state is fundamentally better than an alternative that could be created through an organic movement within that, whether within the world or within a nation state. And so a lot of this literature is written by imperialists. So a lot of it is also written by specifically and it's a weird, I should say, like, to go to terms too. So a counterinsurgent could be a military official. Militaries they study this stuff all the time. They have classes on it. When you go through the military, if you're put into a specific field, you'll be trained in it. And so again, this is like a very normative thing on a lot of levels. but there's also people within the academy who study it, and sometimes they have direct relationships with the military. Sometimes they have relationships with think tanks or, aspects of what we call the military industrial complex. Sometimes they might be in the FBI or they might be private contractors, right? So it's a big world, but it's one of the most common forms of warfare that's fought since World War II. Where the war itself doesn't rise to the level where it's like World War II, where you have a whole bunch of nation states coming together and directly fighting one another, right? So a lot of this is like sort of lessons that are learned by, Europe and the United States, maybe Japan. You could throw different countries in this. After World War I and World War II, which were tremendously costly for Europe in terms of human lives, countries being transformed for the worse, for the better in some cases, maybe afterwards, that they really want to avoid these types of massive conflicts. But then they have the realities of the Cold War, and so they're not trying to avoid conflict totally. A lot of the earlier counterinsurgency wars come out of anti-colonial movements. They come in response to it, of the West trying to ensure that countries that, move on, become independent post-colonialism, stay within the Western capitalist camp. And then on the flip side, the Soviet Union, China, et cetera, are also trying to spread socialism, communism through, diplomatic means and offering an alternative form of developmental path. But also, there's military conflicts that happen because, people, take Vietnam, take Korea, right? People choose to take a side of saying, we want to follow a socialist path, and the West, usually the United States, led at this point, saying, we'll fight you, we'll kill as many of your people as possible. And so, I think that's important to sort of add. I know that I'm kind of going all over the place, but counterinsurgency develops out of colonialism and imperialism. And it's a through line that they themselves cite as well. The so-called Malaya emergency, which is like modern day Malaysia, where there was a big communist movement and a really bloody insurgency against it led by the British. That's kind of an initial point at which people begin to talk about this, but it's really not an origin point, because if you go back before this, there were always people who were colonized that were resisting colonialism. And so counterinsurgency as a theory draws directly upon the experiences of colonizers and how colonizers, tried to maintain control of the colonies. So I think that's a good thing to understand about it. The term insurgency itself, I think is it's an amorphous term for these folks. Like I said, what they're thinking about is a group of people who are willing to take up arms against the state, and this happens a lot, but for them, they're always worried that people who use nonviolent means will become violent. And the reason that they're worried about that is because they know that they try to ensure that people who use nonviolent means are not successful. And as they say, it's easier for them to stop people who are using nonviolent means. And so they very much understand on some level how people progress from authentic grievances. You can think of Palestinians, I think, is a great example of this, there are real, rational, authentic demands and grievances that Palestinians have against the so-called state of Israel. And, it's their land, it's their sovereignty, it's their rights, so on and so forth, all of which are denied. It's a particularly egregious example, but there's a lot of similar movements all around the world where people are denied these things, right? And because they are denied them, and the existing order doesn't allow them to gain them through, peaceful nonviolence means, eventually some group of them will choose to try to start some form of an armed struggle, which again, in the anti-colonial period, you can look at UN resolutions. They said like that is a people's right to do that. In the modern world, as we see again with Palestinians, most of the world no longer, at least most of the governments of the world, and no longer accept this right of people. And I think that has a lot to do with the fall of the Soviet Union and the changes that happened as a result of that. But yeah,
it kind of depends who is doing the resisting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's Ukraine, for example, then it's of course send all the weapons and all of that. But if it's Palestine, then no, they don't have that. Right. It's only
it's a very all of this stuff is very duplicitous, or like I don't want to say it's all in the eye of the beholder. I mean, in the counterinsurgency field manual that the United States has, like they have passages which you will read as an acceptance of supporting a fascist state as long as that fascist state is pro-US.
Which is happening all the time.
They don't put it quite in those terms, but they'll say something along the lines of like, we don't really care if a government is super democratic or very authoritarian, as long as the interests of our nation are protected by this place. And so, yeah, it's I mean, Ukraine is an interesting example for a lot of different reasons, but it is fascinating to see the language that people will use to say the rights of Ukrainians to take up arms or to defend themselves, or we don't care whether, these people are, whether there's neo-Nazis and so on within the ranks of these folks because they're defending their sovereignty. A lot of these different kinds of rhetorical things that people say about Ukraine that then go out the window when you talk about Palestine and you say, oh, they're Islamists, so we don't support the right, they're terrorists, these kinds of things. And the linguistic tricks are quite obvious with those two examples.
Yeah, exactly. You referred to the field manual. So there's this span of documents, like there's the Frank Kitson book that you mentioned in the podcast as well, which is from 1970s, I guess, and he was active way before. And then the field manual you're talking about is from 2000 something, right?
So I think it's like 2006, something, 2005. It's somewhere early on in the Iraq War it gets published.
Do you want to talk a bit about those documents? I mean, both of them, like to sort of put it into a historic frame where it was and where it is now, so that people understand that there's the thread from early on up until now, which is still there.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I would say about counterinsurgency is that there's no one way that counterinsurgency wars are fought. There's different ideas about how they should be fought, and there's contestation within those, and there's also ways that they are always a part of like a broad toolkit that militaries have, right? And so the thing about Kitson, he's from a military family. His own experience. He participates in the counterinsurgency campaign in Malaysia. He participates in Kenya. He writes books about his own experiences. He's somewhat self-aggrandizing as a figure. He's hard to take honest, and this is true of a lot of them. It's like, they're also careerists and trying to make a name for themselves. Kitson ends up a knight. There's all this BS. And so it is sometimes hard to, I think, disentangle reality from mythology with these figures. And there are times where, as Orsami Burton would say, is like they're just lying to you and you have to parse it out. So it's like, all of this is a difficult literature to read because there's just a lot going on. And these people at the end of the day are, just kind of full of shit, and but Kitson, Malaysia or Malaya in that period, Kenya, I think maybe a little bit of involvement in Cyprus, and then Northern Ireland. So he writes the low intensity operations is the name of the book that Orsami and I did a 2-part discussion on. And yeah, that's an important book, within this kind of genre. I would say, like, a lot of what he has to say, the field manual is not that different, is part of what I would say. The field manual is different in terms of it's, written, 30, 35 years, something like that later. It's a little bit more updated. It's a little bit more attentive to kind of defining and talking about the forms of propaganda and media operations and psychological warfare. And again, like, I sound like the tinfoil hat guy right now, but like they just talk about this stuff. They're not shy about it. And
if I remember correctly, you mentioned that the latest document, the field manual, was written together with contributions from people from Atlantic and academics, and it wasn't just the army just making shit up. It was
so they do at Fort Leavenworth, I believe it was. They had a conference where they brought together, and this is something Dylan Rodriguez initially was the person who drew me to this, because he and I had more discussion about the field manual. And he's the person who actually first told me that, you should read this, because in his book, White Reconstruction, he uses it, to talk about actually diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which is maybe something we could talk about at some point. But the field manual is written, Afghanistan and Iraq are wars that the United States is fighting at this time. Petraeus, who's this like Princeton educated general, this guy David Kilcullen, who is an Australian counterinsurgent, which is very interesting, sort of, because all Australia does is support counterinsurgency campaigns, really. Like, it doesn't fight wars, or I'm not saying it wouldn't ever, but it doesn't like declare war on some place and go fight it, right? It sends officers and troops and stuff to help support other campaigns, and largely to help other governments in their region put down insurgencies. And so Kilcullen is one of the co-authors of it as well, which I also think is interesting because it's a U.S. manual, but you have this Australian that's written a lot of it. It's also important that these are both settler colonies, right? And settler colonialism is really important to counterinsurgency literature as well. But the process, they bring together a whole bunch of people. The Atlantic, I always love to point out the Atlantic thing because they are, in my view, the most counterinsurgent publication in the United States, even more than, like, I mean, the New York Times is right there too, but the Atlantic has a very specific way of always telling people that they're too radical and trying to beat them over the head for being too radical. So yeah, the Atlantic reported about it in really glowing terms, and about what a great forum it was for the exchange of ideas between journalists and military and human rights organizations and academics. And so yeah, it's this kind of and those are the forces, like, and this is not to say that everybody that's involved in journalism or everybody that's involved in academia or, it's not a conspiracy. It's just that there are a set or a group of people who see shared interests in like U.S. hegemony for the U.S. counterinsurgency field manual, and almost every country has some version of this for their own, their own people. They see shared interests in the existing order and believe in defending it, and so they actually agree to sort of work together on, on these campaigns. And what might that look like? It might look like a military operation here, an op-ed, supporting that here, and it's not like these people do it because they believe in it, I mean, I think Noam Chomsky had this interview at one point where he interviews this like journalist or whatever, and he's like, I believe in what I do, I'm not lying. And Chomsky says something along the lines of like, I know you do, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting right now. Like the reason that you have that job and that you do what you do is because you believe in this stuff.
Exactly. You wouldn't be able to
and I
get
think
that
that's a really important thing for people to understand is it's not, some nefarious conspiracy where everybody has dirt on each other, or, J. Edgar Hoover has pictures of people, like that could be part of it. But for the most part, it's people who actually really believe in what they're doing. And so they think of themselves as acting in the public good, on the right side of history, and so on. And they really believe in, an NFL analogy probably won't make sense to your audience, but there's this term in the NFL of like protect the shield or defend the shield, which is like the symbol of the UFL or the NFL. So anyways, the point just being of like, these are people who would proudly chant the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America every day if they were asked to, and so, I guess that's an important point to bring in, but there's a lot of cross collaboration. And so you will see sometimes when you see that article online that everybody's raging against that feels really messed up, or, if we just think about, again, Gaza, you think about how complicit the U.S. media and probably most of the Western media has been in everything that has gone on, and like how they report it, what they don't report, that these are decisions. And I'm sure for certain journalists that, work for these outlets that want to be able to tell the truth, it is deeply frustrating, and some of them quit and some of them lose their minds and whatever. But at an editorial level, at the level of the institutions, it's not that difficult for them because they believe that they're defending Western civilization or something like this by reporting in the way that they are.
Yeah, no, I agree. I try to also keep this focus when people talk about, they're infiltrated, they're paid, whatever. I mean, maybe early on, but we're at a point where the ideological hegemony, it just repeats itself. I mean, it just reproduces itself. So these people don't need to be paid anymore. They're already indoctrinated, and they just keep on because they think this is the right thing. As you say, they've already bought the supremacy. So, and they're part of it. So, I mean, if there's sort of a benefit calculation, they are benefiting from it, and they know it. So, most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, there is a benefit for sure, and they are usually paid, but it's not like it's not like a bribe. It's
no, like, I meant more like it's the status, like this is, I believe in supremacy and I am supreme. So that's the benefit, I guess. But I don't want people to get the idea that this is about only. So we've been talking about colonialism, we've been talking about militaries, but it's not necessarily about militaristic adventures or like some other country. Can we sort of turn that into how would this be applied, or has this been applied domestically?
Yeah. So Mark Neoclis is we had a conversation with him on his recent book, Pacification. And, pacification is another kind of synonym for counterinsurgency, and it actually goes back further in terms of people talked about pacification long before they started using the term counterinsurgency. And for Mark, for Professor Neoclis, he basically argues that this goes way back, that that Rome and Greece to some extent, but definitely by the time you get to Rome, that they're very they're thinking a lot about like what we would call today counterinsurgency. And I think Orasami Burton has talked about this a lot too, about and he also works with Neoclis's thought around it, of like, it's not that there's war that goes on in foreign, and that domestic there's something else, or that it's that these societies are fundamentally built, liberalism really as a system, and I don't mean like I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican or I'm a social democrat or whatever. I mean like political liberalism, the idea of rights, individual liberty, private property, these kind of ideas. That it is constantly, even when you read the people who wrote this, whether it's like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or whatever, these kind of theorists, that they're constantly thinking about enemies within and about social wars. They want to avoid. This is something Neoclis talks about a lot. Is like they want to avoid civil war at all costs, which again is kind of that World War II, World War I comment too. Is like you want to avoid something where you could see millions of brothers and sisters like fighting each other, kind of. But in order to do that, they believe that you have to constantly have these kind of, again, wars against internal enemies. And to give examples of what that looks like, I mean, so it could be Muslims, it could be immigrants, it could be Black people, it could be indigenous folks. It could be also like kind of moral panic stuff of like, whether it's sex criminals or homeless folks or whatever, is that societies are, you just watch the news, right? And it's like, what in the news are they telling you today is the thing that you have to be concerned about within your city or your state? And that gives you a good idea of what is being demonized for this kind of warfare, because and this is the United States is a supremely violent state, more so than a lot of other places. We have a lot more gun deaths and things like that than most places, but it's in the United States, it's like, it's very telling every day. They lead with a shooting, they lead with a this, and, they show you the pictures of the suspects and so on. And it's all a process of trying to get people kind of primed and accepting of a war that is not really about that individual person or that individual actor, but a type of policing and, which is to say a form of warfare really against a group of people. And so it's, and this is, again, it starts to sound a little bit conspiratorial or whatever. It's also something that counterinsurgents talk about a lot. So they think about the domestic arena as connected to the foreign arena. So again, just to use an example for the United States, just for ease for me, right now, we see students on visas that are here to study getting pulled off the street and getting thrown into cages because they wrote an op-ed or because they showed up to a protest. And these are things that through any regular, even through our own constitution in the United States, there's nothing that says that people can't do this stuff. And typically as a result, they do end up getting released, but in the meantime, their lives get messed up. They become, maybe will have difficulty getting jobs from people. Maybe they won't be able to finish their degrees, or they'll be traumatized, or they're thrown in cages and tortured and all kinds of stuff, And so there's, that's just like one example, but it's because to the state, they see that internal stuff, even those very small level things, as connected to a military campaign that they're trying to win. And it's the same in the United States of like, if there's internal protests or like, Black Lives Matter or Standing Rock in the United States when, indigenous people were trying to defend their land against a pipeline that they didn't want, that all these different forces get deployed from, military, military contractors, policing agencies, FBI, and then also the media to do different types of demonization and things like this. And so it's really kind of the United States uses a term full spectrum dominance, which is like that they want to dominate from outer space all the way, down to the ground level. And it's kind of like that of just that they see all these different spheres where they need to engage in struggle. One of those being the narrative sphere, which is like the media, and then there's the political, there's the court systems, there's the military, and all of these things need to be working in alignment. And I should say there is always contestation within all of these spaces too, because it's not everybody is going to agree. Not everybody has the same vision. In the United States, it is true that there are spaces where Democratic, party members and Republican Party members will disagree with each other most often when it's convenient for them, because I can make my party look good by fighting you on this specific thing right now. And so you do see contestation within these spaces too, but there is nonetheless always these kind of coordinated campaigns that happen.
Yeah, and this idea that they have to constantly do this, it's not, it doesn't cease, it's always there. But when I think about it, I think they have to do it because what they are trying to continue is unnatural. There is a reason people do defect from these ideas, because they are, at the end of the day, they're opposing life itself. They're consuming life without giving anything back, sort of.
Yeah, there's no reflection at all within the literature of what is being defended. It's these ideological, kind of mythological, sort of mystical ideas. Excuse me. And so, it's a religious kind of perspective almost, of and it actually, it's not kind of, when you start to talk about the state as, we use the term sovereignty, and people mean a lot of different things by that. And I'm not talking about being against indigenous sovereignty, which of course is just, a right of people to sort of live the way that they want to, that they have historically lived, et cetera. Palestinian sovereignty. I'm not against these ideas, but that term itself means above everything else. It means godly, and the state sovereignty is a view of your state as your God. And the reason that indigenous sovereignty is not compatible with this idea is something that I was really taught through conversations with the Mohawk Warrior Society folks, their book, is that indigenous sovereignty is more like everything being godly. Like if everything is holy, then nothing, then nothing is, or it all is, right? It's like we're all on the same level, and so you can't impose something on me that I'm not okay with, because I'm the same as you.
Yeah, the
So you have
hierarchy
to
is
respect
broken,
me, and I think the world would be quite different if we lived according to that principle on a global level. Whereas these people, their vision of sovereignty is a specific idea of God. It is a kind of supremacist view. It is a God that makes them special in ways that others aren't. I mean, and we could think about Zionism with this, but we could also think about Western Christianity, Catholicism, etc., and other religious ideas. I mean, it's not solely, only Western views that can take these kind of supremacist ideas of, a specific group of people.
I think it's part of every religion, I guess. You can find it in Islam, you can find it in Buddhism. Like it's different parts of. I guess it's based on human nature that people want this thing, exclusive salvation, or whatever you'd call it.
Right. I think and I haven't studied religion that well, I think there are probably some traditions that are more accepting of, even if they don't believe that other people will be chosen or saved or something like this, that they're more accepting that, if somebody else believes in something else, then, just let them do that kind of thing. But nonetheless, this idea of sovereignty, yeah, I mean, it is a God power of the state, and so it's even like, I mean, it leads to really messed up stuff. Like, it leads to this idea of like, oh, our missiles are better than everybody else, and so we're the most godly, kind of. I mean, that's kind of a crass example, but it is sort of like that in certain ways. And so these people have this very religious, I think, idea of their state, which is funny because it's the same people that would, for instance, rail against some idea of like an Islamic state or something like this, right? Of like the worst, like this is a horrible combination of like a religious fundamentalism with, but the reality is that liberalism, although it proposes itself to be this secular, political ideology, if you read it, it's not secular at all. It just incorporates Western colonial Christianity essentially into a political form. And so, yeah, I kind of got sidetracked there, but the main point is that there is no self-reflection from these people that the system that they've created actually is not ecologically sustainable. It doesn't allow for, the chaos which is embedded within capitalism is never something that can be fully reined in and maintained. They actually believe in something quite chaotic for the world in terms of their system, for people, for the planet, and so on.
Thank you. I don't know how much time you have left, but if
I'm fine right now, yeah.
Awesome, because there are a lot of things I'd like to ask you, but I'll try to keep it around 40 minutes or something like that, more, if that's all right.
That's fine.
Thank you. So I think in both texts, they do talk about this grouping of the opposition or the insurgency or the subversives, whatever they call them, the people they try to pacify. Could we maybe talk a bit about the sort of general way they compartmentalize and then try to work them against each other and all that. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
before we jump into there, I don't want people to think that this is a US thing. It's an empire thing, first of all, and I highly recommend people, especially people watching from Sweden, or if there are other European people watching, just to find this documentary about Operation Gladio, which is about NATO stay-behinds or NATO organized, I don't know, fascistic elements, or also the military intelligence, police, whatever. Like it's like a big. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's not a theory. It is a conspiracy itself that has been trying to pacify any kind of communist tendency in Western societies after, or European societies after Second World War. And this is not like there has been a huge trial in Italy. I think it was end of 80s, where they discovered actually, okay, there is a thing called Gladio, which was directed by NATO and so forth, which was involved in killing one of the prime ministers. So this is a thing that actually does relate to us that are outside US but are under the US umbrella, I'd say.
Very much so. I mean, just to that point quickly, and I'll jump into the different groups. Post World War II, there's a real, well, actually post World War I too, because the reality is that once the Soviet Union becomes, once the Russian Revolution happens and they win, there's a whole set of maneuvers done in the West to try to ensure that, communism doesn't just sweep through Europe as communist parties hoped that it would, right? And so there are revolutions that fail, and then there are, and that's it. I mean, like, counterinsurgency is just an attempt to subvert revolutionary change, really, at a fundamental level. That's kind of what it is. And yeah, I mean, post World War II, obviously, you have the defeat of the Nazis, the defeat of, fascists in Italy, the defeat of Japan, fascist Japan. And, you have the US in this, as a rising, global hegemon, because it's not decimated in the same way that so much of Europe is by having World War II, not solely, but largely fought. I mean, obviously, Japan took a humongous brunt of it with the atomic bombs and things like this, but
China as well. Many
China. Yep. But these countries are sort of decimated, and so there's the Marshall Plan. They have to kind of come into more of the orbit of the West, and there's a lot of buildup of different methods of counterinsurgency within Europe to try to ensure that they don't fall into the orbit of the Soviet Union. And I mean, even in Sweden and Norway and so on, like, there becomes part of the reason that these states have a version of social democracy, which I know is like been whittled away and declining, but part of the reason that it was the strongest for a very long time is because they were so close to the Soviet Union that the compromises that the ruling classes of these countries had to make with their workers were much more significant compromises than had to be made the further you got away. So in the United States, we really didn't. We had a little bit. We had the New Deal, but in Europe, those compromises are more significant. And this is part of counterinsurgency too. Is there's an understanding that reform is a necessary element, and they also have this emphasis on democracy among some of them. And then there's other schools of thought, right? So I think even though I'm quite clear that what is happening in Gaza is a genocide, it is still a counterinsurgency campaign in that what they are trying to do, and this will dovetail into the next question, or the question that you asked about the different groups, is what they're trying to do is make it more costly for Palestinians to support armed resistance than it is for them to be directly colonized by Zionists, right? And so
they take PA any day of the year.
Right. So they're right. And we had a great conversation with Abdul Jawad at one point where he talked about, the history of counterinsurgency in the West Bank and talking about the Palestinian Authority and all of this and the history of that. And I think, we might say that the West Bank is one of the more, I don't want to call it successful. I don't mean successful in a good way, but it's a counterinsurgency success in certain ways because they have created a very kind of dystopian, distorted thing, but they can open up a shopping mall amid a genocide, right? And so there are these contradictions of it, of course, but ultimately the PA has been able to sort of maintain their order, and their order is in collaboration with the Zionist entity. And so, and then Gaza would be, but for many of these folks, seen as a counterinsurgency failure. But particularly when this was something that was said a lot when Hamas won the elections in whatever it was, 2006, and that this was talked about as we gave these people elections because elections are supposed to be a mechanism of counterinsurgency, but it didn't work because they selected the wrong people, and and so because of that, they then put Gaza under siege and everything else, right? And so and then there's the war, all of that. But the groups, so I used a lot of times actually a kind of different book to talk about this. They often all have some version. Kitson definitely has a version of it. I have to think back to the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. I think it has a little bit of discussion. Terminology on this stuff can shift, but
I think there was also one in Tip of the Spear by Arslan Burton, but I think it was from one of the documents inside the prison. One of the black radicals that wrote something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very common. This stuff is, I'm going to use the terms that they use in this book. It's one behind me, The Ungovernable Society by, I hope I pronounce his name right, Gregory Chamayou. He's a French philosopher. There's always, it's very simple. It's like divide and conquer. This is as old as any kind of warfare, really, of this idea that you have to figure out groups that you can pit against each other and ones that you can use. And there's a lot of different versions of this, sectarianism, like within Islam, how do you can sometimes create divisions. You can sometimes just create propaganda campaigns around existing divisions. This stuff becomes so prevalent that people just reproduce it themselves again, which is a point that you made earlier. It's not always that people are being paid or that there's some, if somebody in Gaza, right, is saying something about Hezbollah or Iran or whatever, this is just the opinion that they've developed because of what they've been shared about the world and so on. And, but that those forms of sectarianism, they have consequences to movements, and within the US, we have a very small left, and there's a lot of sectarianism, a lot of political sectarianism within that left. Right. And some of it is principled, political, ideological disagreements. And some of it is, just not ultimately. And whether it is principled or not, sometimes it doesn't really matter because the result is that we're not effective because we're fighting each other as opposed to working together in some way. So this part I'll read a little bit from. This is from The Ungovernable Society. And he uses this discussion, and this is a good example because it talks about how counterinsurgency gets infused into stuff that people wouldn't think that it's infused in. So he uses this example that I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s. There was this global campaign against Nestle, because Nestle was creating, they had a baby formula that they were sending to the third world that if it wasn't properly, I think it had to be boiled for a certain amount of time or something like this, right? And so there were chemicals within the baby formula that if it wasn't properly treated, that it would be poisonous to children, to babies. And they knew this, and a whole bunch of babies died because, maybe it wasn't communicated well enough to people, maybe there's a language barrier, maybe they just didn't have the resources to be able to process it the right way, and so on, right? But ultimately, Nestle should be held responsible for this, right? And so there's a global campaign to boycott them and, to try to get them to change their practices and all of this kind of stuff. And what do? Well, they hire a counterinsurgency expert. They hire somebody with, and this is, again, because counterinsurgency operates, they do, again, as I said before, things that they call psychological operations, which is like propaganda operations and so on. They want to distort or change the way people think about certain things, is another way to think about what that means. So they hire this person, and a lot of times this is true, like counterinsurgency people work for public relations firms, right? Because you could see the overlap there. If I want somebody to think differently about something, then I need to change the way they think. And so I need to study the psychology of people and how to manipulate. I mean, advertising is all filled with this stuff, right? Like what is it that makes me want to buy this box of Wheaties? Like they're thinking about that constantly. So they hire this person, and basically there's this section in the chapter where it talks about basically that their product is under attack by a plethora of public interest groups. And it says, who are these groups? It says, if you want to defeat them, you need to know them. But this is not complicated. They fall invariably into four main categories. So the categories are the radicals, the opportunists, the idealists, and the realists. So I'll read you what is written here about them. So the radicals, these want to change the system. They have underlying socioeconomic, political motives, are hostile to enterprise as such, and may be extremist or violent. With them, there is nothing to be done. The opportunists, these offer visibility, power, followers, and perhaps even employment. The key to dealing with opportunists is to provide them with at least the perception of a partial victory. The idealists, these people are usually naive and altruistic. They apply an ethical and moral standard. The problem with them is that they are sincere and, as a result, very credible. Except they are also very credulous. If it can be shown that their opposition to an industry or products causes harm to others and cannot be ethically justified, they are forced to change their position. I really want to come back to that one at some point, because this is, to me, like liberals. Like this is supporters of the Democratic Party in the United States. And then the realists, they are a godsend. They can live with trade-offs. They are willing to work within the system and want to work within the system. They are not interested in radical change, but are pragmatic. This is another form of liberals for sure. And so he lays this quick thing out. He said, faced with protests, the way forward is always the same: to negotiate with the realists, knowing that in most issues, it is the solution agreed upon by the realists which is accepted, especially when business participates in the decision-making process. Also, the idealists need to be re-educated into realists, an educational process, according to Dutchin, which requires great sensitivity and understanding from the educator. If you can work with the realists and re-educate the idealists, they will switch over to your position. Once these critics of conscience have been turned, the radicals will lose the broad credibility that the support of these moral authorities has conferred upon them. Without support from the realists and idealists, the positions of radicals and opportunists are seen to be shallow and self-serving. At this point, you will always be able to count on the opportunists to accept the final compromise. And then at the end, they just sort of sum it by saying, such then is the general strategy: to cooperate with the realists, to converse with the idealists so as to convert them into realists, and to isolate the radicals and gobble up the opportunists, right? So this is like, again, that's like very 101. There's a lot of different versions of this, but that gives an idea of how these people think about the psychology, really, of different types of people and how to manipulate them in order to win a kind of, ideological war and run a successful campaign. And in this case, it's just about, Nestle and Monsanto or whatever. It's like these corporations, these evil corporations trying to figure out how do we clean up our PR. And they're literally bringing in military counterinsurgency strategists to help them figure that out. So that's another thing I say that is like important to understand about not the conspiratorial thing is like, no, like this is in the early 80s or late 70s that you have corporations running, basically military psyops on like their customers.
Yeah, that's insane. But that's how it went. And now the Nestle guy, the guy who says water shouldn't be a human right, sits at the head of World Economic Forum.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite
exactly. And so that it's just an important thing to see, because like what we think are these barriers between like military operations, warfare, and just like capitalism and corporations and media, like this is all a very fluid world with people that work together to solve what they see as problems for their own, it can be as tiny as their own company or corporation, or as big as, U.S. hegemony globally or whatever.
I mean, we see that very openly in Gaza as well. Like, all of these actors, they work together. I mean, Google, Meta, Amazon, whatever. I mean, all of big tech plus all of big media. Like, it's so obvious now for anyone following Gaza that these are actors that specifically act together. And if there's a shift, they all shift together as well. It's not like like we see that today, for example, these days, that the narrative is slightly shifting for some reason. It's unclear why. I mean, but there is some narrative shift, and you see that like the shift is tandem. It's not one or two people just saying dissidents. No, this is calculated. So
yeah, it is an interesting time for that. But you're right. I mean, it is. And that's a part of this too, is like there's, and as you say, it's not clear why. Sometimes there are these shifts to like, we want to distance ourselves from this thing a little bit, but we're not actually going to do anything to stop it, or, but yeah, I mean, I think public relations is a really important thing to kind of understand all of this in, which is just sort of like it's really about managing people's perceptions at the end of the day, and it's scary on that level, right? Because it's everything from just the TV shows that you watch that you think, oh, it's just a TV show, to the books that are promoted, to radio, and it can lead you to tinfoil hat land pretty quickly. But I think it's really important for me, it's really important to kind of maintain a materialist analysis amid all of this too, and just understand that, look, there's a world order that is very beneficial to a class of people, and there are orders within nation states that are very beneficial to classes of people, and they want to maintain those, and that they're willing to do a lot to do that. And to me, that's clarifying too, for us to understand that, fighting against these things or trying to change them is never going to be easy, because they do approach it with, they're willing to fight a war over, whether Nestle can still send baby formula that's poisonous to the third world, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, then they're extremely adaptive. That's also another thing that people should keep in mind, that this is not, they don't have set positions other than they want to save as much as they can from their empire.
Yeah, I'll read you another little quote, and maybe we could talk a little bit, if you want, about elections. I don't know if
Do you have
a question about that? Did you want to bring
I know that was my more or less next question.
Go ahead.
So we soon will have an election here in Sweden, and especially after during Gaza, there is some sort of awakening amongst people, and there has been many occasions where the left party here, the parliamentarian left party, or the ones that are in the parliament, have been a disgrace. I mean, they've done so many bad things about this issue, and people keep asking about who are we going to vote for. It's like, so I think it would be great to talk about elections as you say, elections as counterinsurgency, but also like what's the alternative? I mean, people keep thinking like, okay, we live in this great democracy in the West, so if only people vote correctly, everything will be all right. And I think that we need to shatter that illusion, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's interesting in some respects within counterinsurgency literature is there's actually a fair amount of debate about elections. So there's this whole, like, what I've talked about mostly throughout this conversation is what we might broadly call hearts and minds counterinsurgency. So it's a counterinsurgency that cares about what you feel and what you think, and is trying to win the war of what you feel and what you think. And then there's like so there's this book, for instance, that's called Pathological. Let's see if I can find it. Hang on. Pathological Counterinsurgency. And let's see if I can, the full title, Pathological Counterinsurgency, How Flawed Thinking About Elections Leads to Counterinsurgency Failure. It's a book by Samuel L. Green. And again, like, this is a good example of, this book is published by Lexington Books, which is an imprint of Rowan and Littlefield, which is an academic publisher. So like, the field is a very weird field, because it's just like, there's just academics who sit around and study like what's successful and what's not successful within counterinsurgency.
Yeah, I mean, that's another question. Like, why are they writing these things? But we can take that later. Sorry, I don't.
I think again, I think for the most part, these are again real believers. They're people who believe that there are things like radical Islam or, communism or whatever that we don't want, because these things are so terrible, and we believe in Western civilization and capitalism and democracy, right? And so, like, I think that there's unfortunately an inordinate number of people who just kind of fall into that sort of normative worldview, which of course has been constructed as a project over decades and decades. But, one of the interesting things about this book is that it basically says that it counters the hearts and minds approach, as does a book called Bullets Not Ballots, which like actually just says no, like what's most effective is to just kill people, which is again kind of, I mean, I think if you wanted to see a book written in the U.S. that lays the groundwork of what we've seen in Gaza, it's a book like that, because it basically says like, look, you can't bargain with these people or win their hearts and minds. Ultimately, what you have to do is like punish them into submission. But Samuel Green's book, The Pathological Counterinsurgency, he says American administrations from Kennedy and Johnson to George W. Bush and Obama assured wrongly that they could accomplish counterinsurgency goals that required the transformation, this is the important part, required the transformation of unwilling governments and elites in another country. Any change agenda depends on the ability and willingness of a country's leadership to enact this change. A third party should not delude itself that it can win hearts and minds for another country or convince local leaders to move against entrenched interests due to outside pressure. We have seen that elections do little to change such dynamics. Counterinsurgents should also be clear about the scope and time horizon of needed reforms. Few governments have the ability to make changes that are swift and sweeping, even if they are democratically elected. A country that is a good bet for counterinsurgency success should clearly show both the willingness and capacity for reforms over time, as well as the ability to endure while reforms are in progress. Such a country might require material support or even boots on the ground to support specific objectives, but would have made a credible commitment to winning hearts and minds itself. So I just thought that this is, it's an interesting thing, because to talk about the counterinsurgency field manual, the U.S. one, their very emphasis is on, successful counterinsurgency. How does it look like? It looks like people participating in local discussions and debates. You develop local leaders, you run elections, people support these folks. There are some reforms made by the government to actually appease some of the demands of the insurgency. And so to use the Sweden example, and again, like I'm not there, I don't know enough about all the conversations that are going on, what the movement's like, but this is the traditional channel. I mean, and this is a through line too for like basically every Western democracy of you're told that political change comes through the ballot, through elections, and it is kind of the end all be all of political activity. Counterinsurgents wager that they can channel people through those means, and because those means are not meant for radical transformation, that the existing order will be maintained no matter the outcome of the elections. Sometimes they're wrong about this in certain contexts, right? And so Allende won an election and then they had to kill him in Chile. Chavez won elections in Venezuela. Maduro wins elections. They would prefer him not to be winning those elections. Hezbollah just, I think, finished municipal elections and won, in more seats than it was expected. Hamas again won an election, and actually it was an election, I was reminded recently, supposed to be over all of Palestine, right? But not just Gaza. So there's this reality that sometimes elections don't play out the way that the ruling class wants. And so I do think that's something that shouldn't be totally discounted even within the West, that, it is, there's some window, I think, that has to be really determined by organizations, movements, parties of what can actually be achieved through these, and I don't want to dismiss it as nothing, because it's, I think that position can be somewhat nihilistic too. But it's also quite clear that there is a group of people, and I think it makes a lot of logical sense, that say, hey, like everything, like channel everything, So we see a lot in the U.S. This is really bad and grotesque. I mean, I think this last election was really painful for a lot of folks because obviously, I mean, there are a lot of people who support Donald Trump, but, on the left, there's nobody who actually really supports Donald Trump. But the Democrats are really a fake form of opposition. I mean, they are very much a ruling class party, and they're a Zionist party, and they're an imperialist party. And so those of us that are anti-imperialists or anti-Zionists, there's different approaches people take. There are people who are like the uncommitted movement or whatever that try to figure out like, okay, how do I try to push some kind of change within this? And even though I think I talked about that as like a sort of counterinsurgent thing at some point in the discussions, I mean, I'm not posing that the people who ran that campaign are necessarily intentionally being counterinsurgent. Again, it can just be people who like believe, they're true believers that, hey, like as a tactic, I can use this and, maybe we can get a policy shift from these folks. The difficulty is, and I don't know when what this breaking point is specifically with Palestine and Zionism, is that there's a world order and there's an existing capitalism that includes the state of Israel as an important node in that order. And whether, I think Max Isle is the one who said this, it's not that there couldn't be a different capitalist world order that didn't include them as a key node. And that might include more of, Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and, and so on. It's not that that's not possible. It's that is not desirable to the capitalists and to, the amount of Zionism too that's within the kind of capitalist sphere. So some of it is ideological and some of it is material. And I can't gauge for like I can't even gauge that with the United States right now, but I can't gauge that for other societies of like how deeply embedded is this within the ruling class and how much space is there for just reform of that view that somebody could say, okay, actually it has reached a point where it is no longer materially makes sense for us to support political Zionism and this so-called state of Israel because the costs to us exceed the benefits of it. I don't know what that breaking point is, but I don't think we're that close to it yet. I think that there's what we're seeing in terms of a narrative shift is an attempt maybe to just get back to a phase where people feel like the genocide of Palestinians is a slow burn as opposed to something that is producing so much outrage and so much political discussion and protest and so on. I think that Western societies are probably getting a little bit tired of that, and so they're trying to figure out like how can we restore a little bit of a balance where it's not every morning that people are sharing videos of, children being burned alive in a school or something like this, or people, dying because food has been kept out for 90 days. So, yeah, I know I'm rambling and I've gone off track, but yeah, is there anything specific that you want to ask about elections? I can try to dig back in there.
I mean, maybe we can talk about what are the alternatives. Okay, like
Yeah.
I completely agree that this, like, what I'm proposing isn't either. Oh, forget about elections. They have a function. They can have a function which we can talk about as well. I think like it might be a good way to create some momentum, energize people, but not as a as an end goal for just okay, go. Let's see if we can make the 4% threshold or not, because you'll probably want, and then when you want, you're just going to squander all that energy. But if you can actually take that energy, because I mean, it gives you a platform, it gives you a sort of tools to bring people together, and then you can organize together, and then maybe you can do something more after that. Maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different thinking around elections, and there's a lot of good theory within, radical and revolutionary circles around elections too. And yeah, I mean, the things that you laid out are important. I mean, I guess part of what I would say too is like, it's interesting to read the counterinsurgency literature to see how they talk about what the insurgents do. And there's like an admiration within the literature to some degree, even though they see these people as their mortal enemies, is that they understand that in their view, an insurgency provides a lot for the people who support it, right? And so one, it provides a political kind of banner. It usually connects to a set of demands that people agree with and are popular among the group of people that are supportive of it. And that there's provisioning, there's usually mutual aid, there's, and so I like, even as we think about what is Hamas or what is Hezbollah or, what was, any other, the Zapatistas, like, you could think about all of these different movements historically. And there's the piece that people say of like, okay, what gets focused by a lot of folks is, that, there's terrorism, or whatever. But that like, we could just set that aside, that's a whole different, debate and a longer discussion of what do people think about political violence and all of that. But the reality is that these movements also have provided people with, different structures and forms of life than what has been allowed to them under the colonial order that they operate within. And, to use an example from the US, the Black Panther Party, right? So a lot of people focus on the Black Panther Party of, they did armed self-defense and they had guns and stuff like that. And this is a part of, that it's true on some level. There was this period of kind of counter policing, or like, trying to keep police brutality out of their neighborhoods, which was really what it was about. But there was also what people talk about as the survival programs, right? And this is directly connected to what you're talking about, right? In terms of alternatives, is that, they found needs that the society was not fulfilling. They found demands that resonated with their community, and they organized in different ways to meet those demands, to provide political education to people along the way, to bring people into their ranks. And so that is kind of, I mean, so in terms of what is an alternative, I think that, it's a movement that has some sense of, what do the people really want? Understanding your community and understanding, whatever that looks like. I'm not saying it's like, your community could be a subset or, a group of people who face a specific type of repression within the dominant society or whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be, in my view, like populism totally, because a lot of times people are heavily indoctrinated with things that they want that you're like, yeah, I don't agree with you. I don't want the same thing as you here.
No, exactly.
But
it's maybe more like needs based. I mean, like
yeah.
when you described this, I thought directly about Hamas, like the origins of Hamas, which is a charity based organization that was trying to fill the gaps of not having a state.
Mm-hmm.
And being under occupation and all that. So
so I mean, this is even within the counterinsurgency literature, they're quite clear. Like, they don't see insurgencies as coming out of nowhere. They understand that an insurgency is basically a political movement that is able to tap into organic demands, give a voice to those demands, give a political vehicle to try to achieve those demands, and along the way figure out ways that it can meet certain areas where the existing order, the state, the colonial enterprise, whatever it is not meeting those needs, and try to figure out collectively, okay, how can we help with some of this? We're not going to be able to do it all because we don't control everything. But, and so this is also why a lot of times I think that insurgencies in the United States, or not in the United States, in the modern world, take a kind of religious character too, because religious institutions can be a space for this, right? Historically, churches and mosques and synagogues and all these places, they provide a lot of things outside of just the faith and the and so actually I think even for political folks who are like, okay, I don't want to organize a religious movement, that there's a lot to look at in terms of models of religious institutions, in terms of can we do school? Could we do daycare? Could we do, what are the things? And I don't know, Sweden, that's different than the United States. It's very grounded in whatever political environment you're in, to know what are the things that are not fulfilled right now by this space, and how do we figure out which of them we can fulfill ourselves and which of them we're going to fight for, essentially. And again, that fight, it can have an electoral component, I think. But I just don't think that should be... You need a political vision that is more holistic than that, and that won't be subsumed into what are we going to do this election cycle? What are we going to do next election cycle? What bill are we going to try to pass? What person are we going to try to get elected? That can be a part of it. And especially when your movement gets large enough, where you have a critical mass where that actually has some legs to it, it can make more sense. But I think it's a mistake to approach those problems from a position of weakness, of like, if we don't get this bill passed, then, what are we going to do next, kind of thing. Or if Bernie loses the election, then this is going to, it's like, you have to be a political movement that, where the outcome of the election is one arena, and a lot of that arena is, a space for a pulpit, a space to educate people, a space for people to become familiar with your movement, a testing ground to see how many people support you. Those kinds of things, those are all important considerations. But I think even movements can do that without elections. And so I'm not even saying that, I'm not saying that people... I don't have a strong opinion on whether or not elections can be a part of the arsenal of movements. They have been historically. I just think that we have adopted a view that elections are sort of all that matters within political process, and that is a view that the ruling class and counterinsurgents want us to have, is that the only thing that matters is that we're able to vote at the end of the day.
Yeah, then they can confine the discussion into those tiny, well-formulated boxes. And if you're out of there, if you sort of go beyond that box, then you're just no. That's you can't talk about politics anymore. Like that happens all the time with this anti-Semitism bullshit as well. Like that's how they get, for example, many of the left politicians. What happened to Corbyn? Something similar is happening right now in Sweden.
There's one in the U.S. right now too. There's a New York mayoral candidate, Zoran Mamdani.
Okay, yeah, I think I've seen him, but
and he's definitely more left. He's the most left-wing person running, but they've made him take these. He's now had to say, "I support the state of Israel and the right for it to exist and defend itself." And so it's like, it's a tactic that they use, and it's a double-edged sword too, I think, for them, because it's not a double-edged sword. It's hurtful in multiple ways because, one, it's politically wrong, but like morally, and also like no state has a right to exist. No state has a right to defend itself against occupied people. Like these are not actual rights that even exist. But beyond that point, it then, I think, is also effective in breaking apart support because, a bunch of us are like, I'm not going to support this guy now because, I would fall into that camp most of the time. And people would call me, the ultra leftist or the unhinged radical or whatever because I don't want to do that. Yeah. But it does have that effect because people want to vote for candidates that they believe in. And when you see somebody capitulate to Zionism like that, especially amid a genocide, it does hurt their support. Yeah. And obviously he's making some kind of calculation, as they all do, that they think that going against Zionism is something that their campaign won't be able to bear. Like, I don't necessarily think that these people believe this stuff. Some of them do, but some of them do not. And they're just making a kind of cynical political move to say, okay, I think I have to have this much of the Zionist vote. And if I don't do that, then, I'm going to lose, or I'm going to face even harsher attacks in the media. It's like they're going to come after you anyway, bro. They don't, exactly. These people don't care.
Exactly. No, I just don't get how people don't understand that. Looking at the great example of what happened to Corbyn, like it doesn't matter how much you cater to their bullshit. It's just not going to work. The point is they want to take you down because of your politics. They will take you down if you don't fight. Like, I think one thing so-called left or leftist politicians should learn from the right wing is to double down, to learn to double down on things that you believe in. Like, but that's
and I'm just not clear either that. I'm not clear. It doesn't seem. What I'd say is taking that position, to me, especially for a left candidate, I don't think it's a winning. I don't know what the calculus is, what line they're trying to thread there, but I just don't think you can win anymore as a leftist saying those things because your base of support involves too many people who are like, come on, man. Yeah. Like, I'm watching babies with their heads like severed off every morning, and you're going to tell me that is something that we have to politically defend? Like, get out of here, Yeah.
And the sort of the vote they're going after with that statement is already taken. They're never going to take that. The right has already claimed that, and you'll never get that. But I think it's more about there is this element of control from media, from higher above, that once you get that label, and I really want to talk about this with Asa Winstanley, because he's covered this thing with Corbyn. So once you get that label, you're dead. Because they do go after you really terribly. They write about you every single day until you're out, until you can't take it anymore.
And I think there's a level of it's kind of like in the United States when people go against the police, that there's, I think, a fear factor that comes in for people at a certain point of like, will some unhinged person take me out if I don't take this stand? I think that level of fear, because you get death threats and things like this, and so I do think that's part of the equation too that's not maybe talked about enough, is that I think that for a lot of these people that there's a real fear element that probably comes in at a certain point for their families and so on,
And that happened quite often in the US, elsewhere as well. But like political assassinations is a tool that they have. We're approaching the end, and I don't want people to just be depressed. And also this is a question I have myself. What do we do with all this information? Because we don't want to go around and just be paranoid and don't trust anyone and stay away from organizing because there will be some infiltrator, all that. It's how do we approach this?
It's a good question, and I think that's a question that a lot of people are trying to figure out right now. I think the first thing is that it's important to have information on the different tactics that, your enemy, to use their term, but they're the enemy, not us, that your enemy is using, right, in order to try to, I like the term disarticulate, your movements, right, which is really what that is. They talk about those different types of people. That's what they're doing, is they're saying like, okay, this is a whole, and we're going to take the pieces of it and we're going to break them apart in different ways and pull some of them over here and some of them over here. And so one is to be really clear whenever you see that happening, whenever you see stuff and you're like, this is pitting us. Sorry, one of my kids' toys just screamed at me for some reason. No idea why. Is that you see, whenever you see movements, whenever you see them confronted with things, and a lot of times this is the form of like infighting, or even like, it's a problem with a lot of Twitter discourse, or social media discourse that like turns people against each other. And it's like, okay, so one is like, how do we be productive about this? One is to get off of social media. One is to have real conversations with people within your organizations, help people understand that it's not about like an individual, bad actor, or, somebody that tweeted something out. It's like, we need to be clear that in order for us to be successful, we're going to have to work together. And that means sometimes also that the radicals also do have to make certain sacrifices within organizing spaces and so on, right? Of like, okay, I'm going to fight for what I believe we should do right now. But if the whole group decides that we're going to do something else, then I kind of need to go with that as well and support it, because keeping this thing together and maintaining a space where we can have these arguments and we can try to move ourselves forward, that there's value in those spaces, right? There's value in those organizations, in those movements, and so on. And so there's some part of it of just understanding that one of the important weapons that these people have, or one of the ways that they try to, one of their weapons is this weapon of division, right? And that doesn't mean also that we have to have like a bad unity that always leans to the right and always accepts the most pragmatic and realistic. I mean, I think it's also important maybe to use some of this literature to show those folks of, look, they want us to do that too. They also want us to always be pragmatic and realistic. And so it's important for us to have a political vision that goes beyond what currently exists, that, has we need some kind of transformational vision of how do we change the world that we live in, and because the world that we live in is the world that is enacting the genocide in Gaza, right? And that includes, the way Sweden is set up. It includes certainly the way the United States is set up, or the UK, or any of them, right? And so there has to be, I think, a transformational vision. If people don't like the term revolution, that's fine. But you have to say, okay, we're gonna try over time, to transform so that this could never happen again. Yeah. And that's a key. And then I think studying, like, the counterinsurgency stuff is interesting, but you can't get too bogged down in it, because you can begin to absorb the ways that these people think, and the ways that these people think are really messed up. And so I think, interestingly, reading a lot of the stuff that they're reading and trying to figure out how to defeat, whether that's like Che Guevara or Fidel Castro or Mao Zedong or Lenin or whatever, like, those are books that I recommend people that actually read theory and political thought that is developed by people who are trying to change the world. Now, depending on what people's politics are, they may not agree with the types of changes that those folks wanted to make. I tend to fall into a camp that sort of does, right? But, that's fine. Like, but I still think you have to study, how are you going to change the world? And I think it's important then to look at people who have tried to do this, and to see what their political visions were, what they came up against, and how they strategized about how they're going to deal with it. It's not going to be the same, because, again, every state is its own entity. Every local condition is different. But nonetheless, how they analyzed and thought about tactics and strategies and ways, I think, is really informative, and can also help us with some of these questions around, like, elections, because they all used elections at different points for different reasons as well. But it wasn't for them either, like, this idea of, oh, we're going to elect the revolution. Like, they didn't think that, And so, yeah, that would be my advice, is to collectively study, revolutionaries, and then to look at stuff like counterinsurgency, just to understand the processes, and to not think everybody is a counterinsurgent, like, just because they're doing these things, and even if in movement spaces they are. Some of them could be, and that's an important thing to be aware of as well. But it's to be able to have discussions then about, we shouldn't do that, or we shouldn't take that path, because, or we shouldn't turn against each other about this thing, because that's actually what our enemy, wants right now. And that can lead to uncomfortable and not fun arguments and debates and things like that too. But that's just a part of, organizing and movement work.
Yeah, it's part of it. Thank you. That was a great answer. Something I'd like to add there is, like, in the end, we never should think they're infallible. And neither is imperialism or the empire in general. Like, they have this system that necessitates all this theory and work they have been putting in for decades or hundreds of years, maybe even, just in order to keep it alive and keep it going as they want it. So It will change.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you read it, those contradictions and myths and fallacies, I think, become quite obvious, because, like, counterinsurgency theory in a certain way is also just another way of saying liberalism. Like, it really is. It's kind of like what they're... And at the same time, what you see is, like, within the heart of these people who believe in liberal democracy or believe in U.S. empire or whatever, like, are these glaring contradictions of, you say that you're for everybody, or that you're for free speech, or you're for, and you actually don't even want people to be able to have certain thoughts, Like there's a deep kind of cynicism, fascism that's embedded here that I think, I mean, I always kind of go back and forth with people on this I think even most liberals, if they actually like sat with a kind of, this is why I do study groups and stuff like that too, is if you sit with other people who are politicized and you confront this stuff, like the contradictions are really stark in a way that you're like, actually, I'm not on board with this.
Yeah,
like I may not totally agree with you on what should be done here, but I don't think that, you nice person who we talk and have coffee together should be like thrown in a detention center because of what you think, And so, it's the contradictions are quite apparent within their own work.
Yeah, that was a great point. So before we end, what kind, like, this is actually my wife's question, but I think it's a really good one. Like, any book recommendations or any pod recommendations other than Millennials or Killing Capitalism, of course. All of that is welcome before we go.
Yeah, I mean, so this book, The Ungovernable Society, is one that I think is really good. It talks about another one that I really like is The Tip of the Spear by Arslan.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
But the thing I like about both of them is that they deal with counterinsurgency. They do it in good ways of like actually looking at like what were the executives saying? Like what were the military people saying? What was the ruling class talking about in this period at which there was a lot of kind of revolutionary energy? They take political economy into into their thinking. They sit with kind of revolutionary movements, and Orsami Burton's book in particular does a great job of that, of really taking you inside of the revolutionary, folks in Attica and in other prison rebellions. So those are a couple of book recommendations. But in terms of podcasts, I mean, man, there's a lot of good ones. I mean, I'm partial to the sphere of folks that, I'm around and who, are my friends in a lot of ways, I think. But yeah, I mean, I like The East as a podcast. I like the Electronic Intifada, of course. I like the work that, Mondo Weiss does. What else? Revolutionary Left Radio, Guerrilla History. I Mix What I Like and Black Liberation Media. And
you're gonna forget someone.
Yeah, I know. I'm like kicking myself already that I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody that I mean, Justin Potter and the Anti-Empire.
We already had him, so people know.
Yeah, great guy. And I mean, I have an episode that'll probably come out before this. They invited me on Tanky Group Therapy, which I was on.
Oh, they did.
Awesome. Onto that space. Nice. So I mean, that's the Red Nation podcast with Nick Estes. There's a lot of really good stuff, and I'm sure there's a lot that I'm either forgetting, and apologies, and but also stuff I just haven't dug into that other people are into, that I just haven't cross-pollinated into those spaces yet. But I mean, I think there's a lot of good media work. We always need more of it. I'm excited that you're starting up this project here. I look forward to watching the work that you do. And I think I'm not somebody that takes the approach of like, everybody's a competitor and, I have to carve out my lane. And there's this term, Elizabeth Robinson, who was Cedric Robinson's, wife. She's still with us, thankfully. But she had this term she used in an interview, I think decades ago at this point, where they did media work on public access and also like kind of an international journalism organization. It was pretty cool stuff. And, she would call the work that they did being the mosquito on the elephant's behind. right? And so it's like, yeah, I mean, there's this huge, our enemies have this multiple entire ecosystems of nonsense.
Yeah.
And we're just like a little tiny, sliver. And so I'm for that growing as much as we can until they kick us off all this stuff, which they're also trying to figure out how to do.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen sometime soon, unfortunately. But yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for this. This was great, and hope to have you again. We have so much to talk about. So.
Yeah. Sorry for being long-winded on different answers, but yeah, it's easy for me to go down multiple rabbit holes when I'm talking about this stuff.
No, I think this was great. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. I think we can end there.
Right, cool.
Sorry, Age, that I told you that it would take 1.5 hours, but we took 2 hours. Sorry about that.
My bad.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. No rush about that. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Have a good one.